The knife was still inside her chest when he found her. Ellen Greenberg, a 27-year-old elementary school teacher, lay found dead on her kitchen floor, stabbed 20 times, blood frozen in a scene that made no sense. 10 wounds were buried deep in her back and neck. Her fiancé stood over her, dialing 911, saying she had killed herself. But what they didn't know was that this moment would ignite one of the most disturbing true crime battles in modern Philadelphia history. Ellen wasn't a woman in despair. She was days away from wedding planning, laughing with friends, teaching first graders, building a future that felt safe and predictable. She was engaged to Sam Goldberg, living in a locked apartment, surrounded by routine. And yet she was brutally murdered in a way that defied logic. What happened next changed everything. Police arrived to a locked door mystery. No forced entry. No defensive wounds on Sam. A knife still lodged in Ellen's chest. Blood patterns that raised immediate alarms. And initially, authorities did what seemed obvious. They ruled the manner of death a homicide. A young woman had been killed. End of story. Or so it seemed. But within days, that certainty began to fracture. And that's where things got darker. Investigators quietly shifted theories. Questions went unanswered. Evidence sat untouched. And a case that began as murder slowly, inexplicably, started moving towards something far more controversial. Ellen's parents were still planning her funeral when they were blindsided by a shocking reversal. The medical examiner changed the ruling. Homicide was erased. Suicide replaced it. But the truth was far more disturbing. A locked apartment. And a fiancé inside. As the city moved on, one family refused. And this is where the case took a turn. When investigators reconstructed the timeline, the cracks widened fast. On the night Ellen Greenberg was found dead, a snowstorm buried Philadelphia. Roads were silent. Neighbors were home. According to Sam Goldberg, he left the apartment briefly to go to the gym, then returned to find Ellen stabbed. But what they didn't know was how tightly that timeline would later unravel. Phone records showed unanswered texts. Ellen had stopped responding. Sam said he broke down the door after finding it locked from the inside. Yet the door showed minimal damage. And that's where things got darker. Because the apartment's security latch raised impossible questions. Inside, investigators noted something chilling. Ellen had been stabbed in the back of the neck, a wound that medical experts later said would have instantly incapacitated her. What happened next changed everything. How does someone stab themselves in the spine, then continue to stab their own chest 19 more times? Blood spatter told a story that didn't match suicide. The knife angle defied self-infliction. Bruising appeared inconsistent with a single-person attack. But the case stalled. Evidence wasn't aggressively pursued. Interviews felt rushed. And the initial homicide ruling quietly dissolved. The medical examiner amended her report after discussions with police. The cause of death remained stabbing. The manner changed to suicide. No press conference. No explanation. Just a paperwork shift that redefined everything. But the truth was far more disturbing. Because once suicide was stamped onto Ellen's death certificate, the investigation effectively stopped. No grand jury. No suspect named. No courtroom answers. Ellen's parents were told to grieve and move on. But they couldn't. Birthdays came and went. A wedding never happened. And the pain calcified into determination. They hired independent forensic experts. Each review came back with the same conclusion. Homicide, not suicide. And this is where the case took a turn. Because the family wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting the system itself. As the Greenberg family pushed back, they uncovered something chilling. Critical evidence had been ignored. The knife wounds were never fully re-examined. Ellen's computer searches showed no suicidal ideation. No note. No history of self-harm. But what they didn't know was how deep the resistance ran. Independent forensic pathologists reviewed the autopsy photos and reports. Their conclusions were blunt. Several stab wounds were delivered after Ellen would have been unconscious or dead. What happened next changed everything. One expert called the suicide ruling medically impossible. And yet, the official record stayed the same. Philadelphia police maintained their stance. They claimed Ellen stabbed herself repeatedly, even through her own spine. And that's where things got darker. Because the narrative now required ignoring basic anatomy. The family requested meetings. They filed complaints. They begged for a reclassification. Each request was denied. Years dragged on. Evidence aged. Memories faded. But the wounds never healed. Ellen's parents described living in a permanent state of suspended grief, waiting for an answer that never came. Then a new detail surfaced. Emails revealed that the medical examiner had changed the ruling after consulting with police, not based on new evidence. But the truth was far more disturbing, because it suggested influence, not science. The family filed a civil lawsuit demanding the manner of death be corrected back to homicide. It wasn't about money. It was about truth. And this is where the case took a turn. The lawsuit forced documents into the open. Internal communications. Contradictions. Silence. Suddenly, the case was back in headlines. Public pressure mounted. True crime communities dissected every detail. Experts spoke out. And for the first time in years, officials were forced to respond. But instead of reopening the investigation, authorities doubled down. They defended the suicide ruling. They dismissed the experts. They closed ranks. And what happened next changed everything. Because the fight was no longer just about Ellen Greenberg. It was about whether the justice system could admit it was wrong. With the lawsuit underway, scrutiny intensified on one person, Samuel Goldberg, Ellen's fiancé, the man who found her, the man inside the locked apartment. But what they didn't know was how carefully the early investigation had avoided pressing him. Sam was questioned briefly, then released. No arrest, no charges, no follow-up interrogation. His phone records were not deeply analyzed. His clothing was not aggressively tested. And that's where things got darker. Because in most stabbing deaths, the closest person is examined relentlessly. Here, that didn't happen. Friends described the relationship as strained. Arguments had occurred. Ellen had expressed anxiety weeks before her death, but nothing that pointed to suicide. What happened next changed everything. Text messages surfaced showing tension the night before. Still, authorities dismissed any implication. They argued the locked door proved no one else could be involved. But independent experts challenged that assumption. Doors can be manipulated. Locks can be misrepresented. And the truth was far more disturbing. Because the entire case rested on a single premise that was never independently verified. Years passed with no movement. The case became a symbol of institutional failure. Ellen's parents aged. The pain never softened. They watched other families get answers while theirs remained frozen in bureaucratic denial. Then, a judge reviewed the evidence. Not to decide guilt, but to decide whether the manner of death deserved reconsideration. And this is where the case took a turn. The court acknowledged serious questions, but the ruling stopped short. It did not force a change. It did not reopen the case. It left Ellen in limbo, officially labeled as suicide, unofficially, widely believed to be murder. And that unresolved contradiction became the most haunting part. Because without a homicide ruling, there could be no arrest, no trial, no closure. What happened next changed everything. The family vowed to keep fighting, no matter how long it took. Because giving up would mean accepting a lie carved into stone. Public attention surged as documentaries, podcasts, and experts dissected the case. Every detail was re-examined. The knife angle, the wound depth, the blood flow. But what they didn't know was how close the truth might be. New forensic technology allowed deeper analysis of old evidence. Experts recreated the stabbing sequence. Their findings were chilling. Ellen could not have delivered several of the wounds herself. What happened next changed everything. One wound would have paralyzed her immediately. The medical examiner's original homicide ruling resurfaced. So did the sudden reversal. And that's where things got darker. Because no new physical evidence justified the change. Only conversations. Pressure mounted on the city. Officials were questioned publicly. Why was this case different? Why was suicide accepted so easily? And the truth was far more disturbing. Because the answer appeared to be convenience. Reopening the case would mean admitting mistakes. It would mean accountability. It would mean scrutiny. And so, the system resisted. Ellen's parents continued their legal battle. They weren't asking for a conviction. They were asking for honesty. For their daughter's death to be called what it was. And this is where the case took a turn. The fight became symbolic. Thousands rallied behind them. Experts signed affidavits. Former prosecutors spoke out. Still, the official record did not change. Time passed. Evidence degraded. Witnesses moved on. But the case refused to die. What happened next changed everything. A new appeal was filed. Ellen Greenberg's story wasn't just about how she died. It was about how truth can be buried, and how hard it is to dig back out. Years after Ellen Greenberg was found dead, the question remained brutally simple. Who killed her? Or why was no one willing to answer that? But what they didn't know was how deeply entrenched the silence had become. Legal experts reviewing the case noted something alarming. The threshold to change a manner of death is lower than to convict someone. Yet even that was denied. What happened next changed everything. The resistance itself became evidence. Independent pathologists testified again. Their language was unequivocal. Homicide, not suicide. And that's where things got darker. Because ignoring expert consensus suggested fear, not doubt. The family's pain stretched across a decade. Holidays passed with an empty chair. Classrooms Ellen would have taught in filled with other teachers. Life moved on without her. But the truth was far more disturbing. Because justice never arrived. The case reached higher courts. Arguments were heard. Judges listened. And this is where the case took a turn. The court acknowledged procedural failures. But still, no reclassification. No new investigation. Just words. And what happened next changed everything. Public outrage intensified. The case became a cautionary tale. A warning about what happens when systems protect themselves. Ellen's name became synonymous with unanswered questions. Her parents continued speaking, even as years weighed on them. They said they would fight until their last breath. Because accepting suicide meant accepting something they knew was impossible. And that unresolved truth is where the story ends for now. No arrest. No trial. No verdict. Only a young woman found dead with 20 stab wounds. And a system that looked away. And as long as people keep asking questions, the pressure remains. Because somewhere between homicide and suicide lies the truth. And someone knows exactly what happened in that kitchen. By 2020, the Ellen Greenberg case wasn't just a suspicious death anymore. It was a national controversy. Legal analysts, forensic experts, and former prosecutors were now publicly questioning how a woman stabbed 20 times could be labeled as suicide. But what they didn't know was how fragile the official narrative truly was. Court filings revealed that the original homicide ruling had been changed without any new physical evidence. No new wounds. No new forensics. Just conversations. What happened next changed everything. Because once that fact became public, confidence in the investigation collapsed. Independent experts testified again. They explained that several stab wounds would have immediately paralyzed Ellen. Others would have caused instant loss of consciousness. And that's where things got darker. Because the suicide theory now required Ellen to perform actions medical science said were impossible. The Greenberg family pushed for one thing only: reclassify the death as homicide. That single change would reopen the investigation. It would allow subpoenas. It would allow suspects. It would allow truth. But the truth was far more disturbing. Authorities refused. Years of appeals followed. Judges acknowledged concerns. Language like unusual and troubling appeared in rulings. Yet the manner of death stayed the same. Suicide. A word that shut every door. Public outrage grew louder. Media coverage intensified. The family vowed this would not end quietly. Because as long as Ellen Greenberg was officially labeled as suicide, the killer, if there was one, would never be named. And someone, somewhere, was counting on that. As years stretched into more than a decade, one haunting reality became clear. No one had ever been held responsible for Ellen Greenberg's death. No arrest. No charges. No courtroom. But what they didn't know was how rare that truly was. Statistically, stabbing deaths are among the least likely to be suicides. Experts testified that multiple wounds to the back almost always indicate homicide. What happened next changed everything. Because Ellen had 10 wounds in her back and neck. Former law enforcement officials began speaking anonymously. Some admitted the case had been mishandled. Others suggested pressure played a role. And that's where things got darker. Because it implied the truth may have been inconvenient. The fiancé remained free. Never charged. Never publicly cleared. Living a life untouched by the storm that destroyed another family. The truth was far more disturbing. Because silence became protection. The Greenbergs aged under the weight of unanswered questions. Every holiday carried the same pain. A future erased. A wedding that never happened. A classroom that would never hear Ellen's voice again. New petitions were filed. New forensic reviews submitted. Each time, the same conclusion surfaced. Homicide, not suicide. And this is where the case took a turn. Because repetition exposed denial. Officials insisted nothing warranted change. But public trust eroded. True crime communities dissected every detail. Independent pathologists released breakdowns online. The case refused to fade. What happened next changed everything. The narrative flipped. Instead of asking how Ellen died, people began asking why the system wouldn't correct itself. That question remains unanswered. And until it is, Ellen Greenberg's death sits frozen between two words. Suicide on paper, murder in the minds of many. And somewhere in that gap lies the truth that still hasn't been spoken out loud. There was never a dramatic arrest in the Ellen Greenberg case. No courtroom confession, no DNA breakthrough. And that absence is exactly what makes this case so disturbing. But what they didn't know was how close justice might still be. Legal experts say one ruling could change everything. Reclassifying the manner of death to homicide would legally reopen the case. Subpoenas could be issued, evidence retested, witnesses re-questioned. What happened next changed everything. Because that single decision has been denied for over 10 years. The knife wounds remain central. Experts insist Ellen could not physically inflict them all. One wound alone would have ended her ability to move. And that's where things got darker. Because accepting suicide requires rejecting medical reality. Public pressure continues. Journalists keep asking. Experts keep speaking. The Greenberg family keeps fighting. The truth was far more disturbing. Because time benefits only one side. Evidence degrades. Memories blur. Accountability fades. Yet the questions remain sharp. Who was with Ellen in her final moments? How was the door truly locked? Why was the original homicide ruling reversed so quickly? Each unanswered question tightens the mystery. And this is where the case took a turn. The story became less about what happened in that kitchen and more about what happened after. Years of silence. Years of resistance. And until those answers exist, this case will remain one of the most chilling examples of how justice can stall, not because the truth is unknown, but because it is inconvenient. Today, the Ellen Greenberg case remains officially closed. Suicide. One word that ends investigations and silences questions. But what they didn't know is that for many, the case is far from over. Ellen was 27. A teacher. A daughter. A future bride. She was not a statistic. What happened next changed everything. She was found dead with 20 stab wounds, and the system asked the public to accept the impossible. Her parents still speak. Still file motions. Still wait. Time has taken years from them, but not resolve. And that's where things got darker. Because justice delayed became justice denied. No killer has ever been named. No courtroom ever heard her story. The truth was far more disturbing. Because someone walked away from that apartment and never looked back.